France, 1918. For 4 years, cameramen from around the world risked their lives to film these images. Sometimes scenes were recreated afterwards so that they might be preserved for future generations. The pictures have been enhanced with the addition of colour and sound. November the 11th, 1918. At 11 in the morning, the guns fall silent. The armistice has been signed. Bugles and church bells sound the ceasefire. Moments before, a Canadian, Private George Lawrence Price, was killed. He is the war's last fallen soldier. From 1914 to 1918, nearly 80 million people were plunged into war. $10 million soldiers died, mown down by bullets, blown to pieces by bombs, incinerated, starved, devoured by rats and lice, killed by the epidemics that thrive on misery. 20 million more were wounded. What lunacy led so many to war? The Austrians, Serbs, Russians, and the Germans. The French with their colonies. The British with their empire. The Italians, the Japanese, the Turks, the Americans. The survivors can count themselves lucky. But they have lost their youth. Or their face. Or their sanity. How did the world unleash this fury? (1914). Who are the men of this period? So carefree, yet so close to war. Many of them are peasants, attached to their land, their traditions, and their religions. To many, war seems unlikely. It's been almost half a century since the last large European conflict. Europe's middle classes enjoy the fine summer of 1914. Vienna, 1914. The writer Stefan Zweig recalls the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. New theatres, libraries and museums were springing up everywhere. There was progress everywhere. What could interrupt this rapid ascent, dampen the elan, which constantly drew new force from its own soaring? A wondrous, carefree spirit reigns the world over. Never has Europe been stronger, richer, more beautiful, or more confident of an even better future. It is still the Belle Epoque of the early 1900s, the beautiful age of optimism and peace. But not for all. Workers put in twice the number of hours of today, yet they earn half as much. Many women earn far less. In theory, at least, children under 12 do not work in mines. In France, the socialist Jean Jaurès gives a voice to the working class. He is worried. He knows that among Europe's elite, many captains of industry speak openly of a war to end the movement for workers' demands. Jaurès writes, "Your violent and chaotic society, even when it pretends to seek peace, carries within it war, just as rain clouds carry the storm." The arms race is good for business. The great European powers prepare for war. Their endless military service trains men to be ready to fight. War and death hover over the planet. For centuries, the rival empires have been dividing up the world with their swords. Britain's conquests reach as far as Australia and Canada. France's from Indochina to Africa. Germany also has colonies, but wants a larger slice of the pie. Prior to 1871, Prussia was a divided state. By crushing France and annexing the French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, it has become the German Empire. The Emperor of Germany, Wilhelm II, surrounds himself with his military leaders. He orders the building of a navy that will rival that of Britain. He wants to give Germany its place in the sun. For Wilhelm II, the United Kingdom has been a threat ever since it formed the Triple Alliance with France and Russia. As a result, Germany feels surrounded and thus vulnerable. Its only true ally is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an amalgam of smaller nations which has been reigned over for 60 years by Franz Joseph I. His long life has been punctuated by tragedy, the suicide of his son, and the assassination of his wife, Empress Elizabeth. Sissi, as she was known, was the sweetheart of his youth. The emperor is now in his 80s. Many of his subjects demand independence. He rules over a tinderbox. But Franz Joseph and his officers and politicians oppose reform of any kind. His empire is referred to as the Joyful Apocalypse. The waltzing and festivities continue unabated, as seen here at the marriage of Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma to the emperor's grandnephew, Karl. But it is his nephew, Franz Ferdinand, who is the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Franz Ferdinand is married to the Countess Sophie Chotek, an aristocrat not of royal blood. Franz Joseph does not approve, nor does he approve of the reformist ideas of his heir. One name echoes like a scream across history. In Bosnia, which Austria-Hungary has recently annexed, is the city of Sarajevo. It is here that the world's destiny changes forever. But Serbia had opposed this move. It wants to expand by uniting the Slavic peoples of the Balkans. June the 28th, 1914, Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian crown, together with his wife, has just escaped a first assassination attempt. They stop at City Hall to protest vehemently. These are the last images of the couple. When they leave the building a little later, they are shot dead. The assassin, Gavrilo Princip, is a 19-year-old Bosnian nationalist. It was the Serbians who provided his pistol. At first, it is covered as a minor news story, but the assassination in Sarajevo will have unimaginable consequences. In Britain, alongside the Thames, the future queen of the mystery novel Agatha Christie, then just 24, notes, "When in far-off Serbia an archduke was assassinated, it seemed such a far-away incident. In those countries, the people were always being assassinated." Few in Britain paid much attention to the black hole of Europe, known as the Balkan powder keg. 2 Balkan wars had left 200,000 dead. By 1914, in Great Britain, those distant tragedies have largely been forgotten. The British monarch George V is also the King of Ireland and the Emperor of India. His realm is huge, but his powers are limited. His foremost preoccupation is Ireland's struggle for independence. On June 28, 1914, he writes the assassination in Sarajevo is one more shock for the old Emperor of Austria. George V has no sense of what is about to explode, any more than the President of France, who has come to London on an official visit to reaffirm the Entente Cordiale, the new friendship which, after centuries of deadly rivalry, now links Great Britain and France. The French president, Raymond Poincaré, may be a moderate, but he comes from the Lorraine region that Germany annexed, a region many in France now dream of reconquering. July 3rd, 1914. With the funerals of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek, the countdown to war begins. Austria's generals have long sought an excuse to subjugate Serbia. They cannot prove the country is responsible for the Sarajevo assassinations, but they managed to convince their emperor. The Austrian Chief of Staff declares, "We must rid ourselves of the Serbs, for they are forever biting the heel of the empire like snakes." But such a stance overlooks Russia, protector of the Slavs. St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, is the seat of Tsar Nicholas II. He celebrates the tricentennial of the Russian dynasty amid the pomp of the Orthodox Church. Parading alongside him are Tsarina Alexandra and their son, Tsarevich Alexei. Close behind are their 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. In 1905, Russia lost a war against Japan and experienced its first revolution. Since then, the country's economy has improved, despite the burden of high military expenditure. In early July of 1914, amid Europe's looming misfortunes, the Tsar takes a cruise on the Baltic Sea aboard his yacht. Despite these images of carefree gaiety, there is a deep sense of insecurity. Peace is under threat. And so is the Tsar's dynasty. His heir, his only son, the 10-year-old Tsarevich Alexei, is a hemophiliac. His blood does not clot. The slightest injury could prove fatal. His hereditary illness comes from his maternal great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who carried the gene. At the time of her death, Queen Victoria's descendants occupied many of Europe's thrones. The Europe of kings and emperors is one big family. The British sovereign George V and Tsar Nicholas II are cousins and could be taken for twins. The German Kaiser is also their cousin and the Tsarevich's godfather. Peace should reign in the family. But in each country, strong nationalist factions see war as the opportunity to finish off a dangerous rival. And the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, is, for Wilhelm II, the most serious threat of all. An attack on the divine right of kings. Wilhelm II had often hunted with Franz Ferdinand. The Archduke was part of his world. And for the Kaiser, a naive and impulsive man, the assassination is nothing short of sacrilege. Wilhelm II, his generals, and the German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg all agree Germany must not waver, but must seize the opportunity provided by the assassination in Sarajevo to demonstrate Germany's will. Together, they decide to support their ally Austria in her plan to invade Serbia. The threat of war doesn't keep Wilhelm II from leaving on July 6, 1914, for a summer cruise on board his impressive 8,000-ton yacht. Wilhelm is publicly confident that the conflict will not spread. He says, "It will all be over in a week. The Tsar won't enter the war because Russia is unprepared, and its ally France has no heavy artillery." On the 20th of July 1914, the President of the French Republic, Raymond Poincaré, arrives in Russia. Poincaré, a secular Republican, has no qualms about supporting an absolute monarch and profoundly religious man like Nicholas II. The visit had been planned long ago. With the crisis, the timing is perfect. Poincaré wants to assess the solidity of the alliance and the readiness of Russia's army. The French president issues a cautious statement. The current crisis must remain limited to Serbia. But as France's leaders prepare to return to Paris, the government cancels all leave for military personnel and calls all generals back from holiday. The Austrians prepare. On the 23rd of July 1914, the government in Vienna sends Belgrade an ultimatum saying that its imperial police should be allowed to investigate on Serbian territory. Belgrade answers back. Serbia is not a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria's ultimatum to Serbia means war for the entire world. The President of the United States, the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, is an intellectual and a pacifist. He wants to preserve America's neutrality. He says, I want to keep the United States out of a European war. In Canada too, fear of war is headline news. The British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, fears an escalation of unforeseeable dimensions. He says, "We are on the brink of the apocalypse." Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. On July the 28th, 1914, the Austrian artillery's Skoda cannons enter into action against Belgrade. And Russia, in accordance with its alliance with Serbia, sends its troops to the Austro-Hungarian border. On July the 30th, Wilhelm II cuts short his cruise. The Kaiser comes ashore with his Dachshund, who precedes him everywhere. Given his alliance with Austria, he issues an ultimatum to his cousin, Nicholas II, ordering him to withdraw his troops from the Austrian border. On the contrary, Nicholas mobilizes. He writes to his cousin and ally in Britain, King George V, "I do not know what may happen. Austria has gone off upon a reckless war, which can easily end in a general conflagration." Wilhelm II, not having received a response to his ultimatum, hesitates. He speaks of saving the peace. But around him, military leaders and industrialists urge him to declare war, blaming Russia for expanding the conflict. On August the 1st, 1914, Germany mobilizes and declares war on Russia. These young German recruits examine the contents of their infantry kits, which include the indispensable extra pairs of socks. Barely out of boyhood, they are issued razor-sharp bayonets and a symbol of the German army, the spiked helmet, meant to deflect saber blows. Most are eager to defend their threatened homeland. As the future writer Ernst Junger notes, "We had come from classrooms and factory workbenches, and a few brief weeks of training had bonded us into one large and enthusiastic group." In St. Petersburg, Russians, now at war, sing the imperial anthem that begins, "God protect the Tsar." The French ambassador is present. He writes, "The Tsar is overcome with emotion. His people have invested him with a divine mission. He is the absolute master of their bodies and souls." The Tsarina appears. Of German descent, she has reason to be concerned. Her brother will no doubt be fighting in the enemy's ranks. August the 1st, 1914. Les Halles, the legendary food market, the heart and soul of the French capital, is in mourning. The socialist leader Jean Jaurès has just been assassinated by an ultra-nationalist supporter of the war. Pacifism's leading spokesman, Jaurès had tried to convince German workers to refuse to fight. He had predicted, "At a time when we are threatened with murder and butchery, there is but one hope of saving the peace, and that is for the proletariats to join ranks. Workers of France, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Russia, let us implore these millions of men to unite to dispel this horrible nightmare." The order for general mobilization is posted across France. On holiday in Brittany, Louis Maufray, a medical student, describes the moment. It's a fine late summer afternoon. I hear the tiny bell of the cathedral, ringing insistently. Everyone stops. We have understood. The women weep. The men, frozen, look at the cathedral's spire, dazed and speechless. It's war. In the distance, we can hear the bells of Viviers, Mondol, Carfontaine, and Bagué-Morvan. It's heart-wrenching. On the 3rd of August, Paris learns that Germany has declared war on France. Jaurès is buried, and with him all hope for peace. In Germany, France and Russia, workers rally to defend their homelands. In France, Poincaré christens this triumph of the nationalist forces the Sacred Union. "3 million Frenchmen are mobilized, following 5 million Russians, 4 million Germans, and 2 million Austrians." Austrian writer Stefan Zweig writes, "In 1914, what did they know of war after nearly half a century of peace? It had become a heroic and romantic legend. People saw it through the perspective of their schoolbooks and paintings in museums. Brilliant cavalry attacks in glittering uniforms, a resounding march of victory with hardly any victims, a wild, manly adventure, a wonderful and exciting experience. That is why they shouted and sang in the trains, carrying them to the slaughter." If they are not happy, they prefer not to show it. In Toulouse, a young farmer, Henri Desperrières, writes, "Any sign of sadness was banished. We swaggered before our fellow countrymen." From the French colonial empire, those known as the natives, along with the Foreign Legion, embark in Algiers or Dakar. On boats almost as crowded as the slave ships of the past, dancing for the camera, they sail towards a world of the unknown. In a villa outside Paris, the Ferrari family comes face to face with the reality of war. The men have been mobilized, as have all Frenchmen between the ages of 20 and 48. But in her rose garden, Jacqueline is confident that René will soon be back, that before the roses have withered, the war will be over. These farmers, off to defend their country, expect to return before the harvest is over. On August the 3rd, 1914, the Germans attack. They count on a rapid victory and a brief war. Their plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, after the German general who devised it, consists of crossing Luxembourg and Belgium before the Russians attack from the east and force the Germans to fight on two fronts. Belgian neutrality had been instituted after the defeat of Napoleon to create a buffer between Britain, France, and Germany. Its violation provokes an immediate reaction from London. Britain declares war on Germany. August the 4th, 1914. In London, King George V says, "It is a terrible catastrophe, but it is not our fault. Please God, it may soon be over." The German High Command calculates that the British won't have time to reach the continent. The Belgian campaign will be over very quickly. But the Belgians stand firm. Albert I, their valiant king, tells his people, "A country that defends itself cannot perish." The Belgians have armoured trains and strong defences protecting their cities. For the Germans, it is an unpleasant surprise. They fall several days behind on their battle plan. To crush the fortresses, they need to bring in their huge Krupp cannons that fire 1-ton shells. So the Belgians destroy their train tracks by crashing their own locomotives into each other. Forcing the Germans to lose time on lengthy repairs. While the Germans mark time in Belgium and the Russians prepare their offensive, the Austro-Hungarians, who expected to punish the Serbs in a week, are stopped in their tracks. The Serbs prove to be fearsome adversaries. After 2 weeks, the Austrian death toll has already reached 25,000. And the Serbs celebrate their victory. For now. All this gives the British Empire time to mobilize. The world's largest navy goes into action. At its head is a young cabinet minister named Winston Churchill. There is no compulsory military service in Great Britain at the time. The country needs volunteers. The famous poster of Field Marshal Kitchener, who fought in Khartoum, proclaims, "Your country needs you." It is a cry echoed by the country's recruiting officers. The modest British army of 100,000 men expands into an expeditionary force of 1 million soldiers, drawn from the Empire's huge reserves. In Canada, these recruits kiss the scriptures and say their prayers, thinking about the long sea crossing that lies ahead. These departures will become the inspiration for Michael Morpurgo's novel War Horse, which tells the story of the battlefield experiences of Joey, the farm horse. Joey had the misfortune to be chosen because he was judged sound as a bell, fit for anything, cavalry or artillery. "10 million horses from as far away as Australia and New Zealand will serve in the British Imperial forces, to suffer and die like the troops, without ever suspecting what awaits them." Many of the horses are not even broken in. Michael Morpurgo describes the soldiers as buoyant with optimism, as if they were embarking on some great military picnic. Joey the farm horse and his cavalrymen quickly discover the reality of war. The first casualties. The first German prisoners. And the Belgians, so courageous to the end. The French also have a resolutely offensive plan, known as Plan 17. Take back Alsace and Lorraine and march on Berlin. Their first objective, Mulhouse in Alsace. On August the 7th, 1914, the French take Mulhouse. This triumphant parade is staged for the newsreels. It features schoolchildren, bouquets of flowers and patriotic outpourings from people in traditional Alsatian dress. This is the French army of August 1914, an infantry made up mostly of large battalions, as in the time of Napoleon, with uniforms unsuited to modern warfare, with conspicuous red trousers and no helmet. They swelter under thick woolen greatcoats in the stifling August heat. They must lug a heavy haversack and the famous Lebel rifle. But the Lebel, like the German Mauser and the British Lee Enfield, has a firepower never before seen. These repeating rifles, with a range of over 1,200 feet, consign the bayonet charges in closed ranks to the past. But these outdated tactics taught in military academies continue and end up costing hundreds of thousands of human lives. Three days after the filming of these scenes, the French troops are driven out of Mulhouse by a counter-offensive. The Germans then turn their machine guns on the local populace, whom they accuse of committing hostile acts towards the Kaiser's troops. In Belgium, the Germans have launched their strategy of reprisals. The Germans are afraid of civilian marksmen. Their atrocities escalate. Anyone captured who is believed to be a sniper is shot. As with soldiers everywhere, alcohol assuages the horror and helps spread tall tales, including one about a German infantryman stabbed by a Belgian priest. Fear of reprisals causes hundreds of thousands of civilians to flee. Belgians, French and British accuse the Hun of terrible atrocities against the innocent. August the 20th, 1914. General von Moltke captures Brussels. He explains, "Our advance in Belgium is certainly brutal, but we are fighting for our lives, and all who get in the way must suffer the consequences." The Germans destroy historical monuments. They lay waste to Louvain and burn its medieval university and irreplaceable library. After only 3 weeks of war, an indescribable hatred seems to rule in all the adversaries. In Belgium, a French cavalryman writes, "I enter a house, climb the stairs, and discover a German pig relieving himself in a drawer full of delicate lace. I shoot him. He dies in his own filth." Everything has been ransacked. The lowest instincts have awoken in these Germans. In the east, contrary to German plans, the Russians have crossed the border and entered East Prussia. And now it is the Germans who begin to flee what they call the Russian steamroller. August the 22nd, 1914. Panic sets in. These German refugees also tell of destruction and pillaging. People are afraid. Uncertainty reigns. Kaiser Wilhelm II vacillates between despondency and martial enthusiasm. His paranoia worsens. He insists, Britain, France and Russia have agreed among themselves to wage a war of extermination against us. But the Germans are confident. They have just won victories at Mons and Charleroi. On the 22nd of August alone, 27,000 French soldiers are killed. It is the single deadliest day in all of French military history. Wilhelm II addresses his subjects.
Wir werden uns wehren bis zum letzten Hauch von Mann und Ross. Und wir werden diesen Kampf bestehen, auch gegen eine Welt von Feinden. Noch nie war Deutschland überwunden, wenn es einig war.
The German army marches on Paris. Despite delays, the Schlieffen Plan is succeeding. The French government has fled the capital. The Germans are now only 30 miles from Paris. Victory is near.